Are you able to authorize and start getting?
What if I told you that somewhere in Nova Scotia, two small pairs of shoes still sit by a door, waiting for feet that will never fill them again? What if I told you that two children walked out of their home in broad daylight, in the few minutes it takes to feed chickens, and vanished so completely that trained bloodhounds lost their scent at the threshold of their own home? What if I told you that weeks later, evidence mysteriously appeared in places that had already been searched by hundreds of volunteers and police officers? And what if the most chilling detail of this entire case isn't what investigators found, but what they didn't find? This is the story of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, a case so bizarre, so haunting, that it's consumed online detectives, torn apart a family, and left an entire community questioning everything they thought they knew about how children disappear. Before we dive into this rabbit hole together, make sure you're subscribed because cases like this, the ones that defy explanation, they're exactly what we cover here. And trust me, you'll want to see how deep this mystery goes. Because what happened on May 2nd, 2025, in a quiet corner of rural Nova Scotia, will challenge everything you think you know about missing children cases. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some secrets are buried so deep, they may never surface. May 2nd, 2025. Gearlock Road, Nova Scotia. A place so remote that the nearest neighbor couldn't see your house if they tried. The kind of place where children played until sundown, where doors stayed unlocked, and where the biggest worry was whether the chickens got fed on time. Caroline Sullivan had a routine. Every morning, just after the kids finished their breakfast, she'd step outside to tend to the small flock of chickens they kept in a coop about 30 yards from their modest trailer. It was a simple task: fill the water, scatter some feed, check for eggs. 5 minutes, maybe 10 on a slow day. That morning started like any other. 7-year-old Lilly and 4-year-old Jack were in their pajamas, watching cartoons in the living room. Lilly had her favorite stick. She called it her magic wand. And Jack clutched a small juice box, the kind that would leave sticky fingerprints on everything he touched. I heard them playing in the next room beside us. Caroline would later tell investigators, her voice still carrying the tremor of that morning. I was drifting in and out of sleep, and they're not the type of kids that we tell them not to go outside on their own. We always make sure that we're out there with them, watching them. But on this morning, something was different. Something that would shatter this family's world in the time it takes to gather eggs. Caroline stepped outside, leaving the children inside where they were safe, where they were contained, where nothing could happen to them in the few minutes she'd be gone. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The chickens clucked softly as she approached, a sound she'd heard thousands of times before. But when she turned back toward the house, something made her stomach drop. The sliding glass door, the one that led from the kitchen to the backyard, the one she was vigilant about keeping locked because of Jack's young age, was open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar. Enough to catch her eye. Enough to make her pause. She called out once. "Lilly? Jack." Her voice carried across the yard, but no little voices called back. She tried again, louder this time. "Kids, where are you?" Silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your heart beat faster. The kind of silence that every parent knows means something is wrong. Caroline rushed inside, checking every room with growing panic. Under beds, in closets, behind curtains, all the places children hide during games. But there was no laughter, no rustling, no guilty giggles. Just empty spaces where her children should have been. The living room looked exactly as she'd left it. The TV still played cartoons to an empty couch. A blanket was folded neatly where Lilly had been sitting. Jack's juice box sat abandoned on the coffee table, still half full. Their pajamas hadn't been changed. Their shoes, Jack's little sneakers with the double knots, Lily's pink sandals, sat neatly by the front door. Not kicked off in a hurry, not scattered in panic. Arranged. Deliberate. As if the children had carefully removed them before stepping outside, expecting to come right back. At 10:47 a.m., Caroline's shaking fingers dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? "My children are missing," she gasped, the words barely forming through her sobs. "They were just here. They were right here, and now they're gone." Ma'am, when did you last see your children? I just went outside to feed the chickens. They were watching TV. They were right there, and now, God, where are they? The dispatcher's voice remained calm, professional. How old are your children, ma'am? 7 and 4. Lily's 7, Jack's 4. They wouldn't just leave. They wouldn't go anywhere without telling me. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong. Within 20 minutes, the first police cruiser pulled up the gravel drive. Within an hour, volunteers were gathering. Within 6 hours, search teams were combing the dense woods that surrounded the Sullivan property. But those shoes by the door, they haunted everyone who saw them. Because shoes tell a story. Shoes scattered in panic, shoes lost in a struggle, shoes abandoned in fear. Those make sense. But shoes placed neatly, side by side, as if their owners intended to slip right back into them, those shoes suggested something far more disturbing. They suggested planning. They suggested that whoever left that house knew they were leaving, and they expected to return. But Lilly and Jack Sullivan never did. As the sun set on May 2nd, 2025, 2 children had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions, empty pajamas, and a pair of shoes that seemed to be waiting for feet that would never fill them again. What happened in those few minutes while Caroline fed the chickens? How do 2 small children disappear without a sound, without a trace, without so much as disturbing the quiet morning air? The answer to that question would consume investigators, tear apart a family, and launch 1,000 theories. But first, they had to search. They had to hope. They had to believe that somewhere in those dark woods, 2 little voices were waiting to be found. Dawn broke gray and cold on May 3rd, and with it came a sight that would define the next several weeks: volunteers. Hundreds of them. They arrived in pickup trucks and minivans, carrying thermoses of coffee and determination etched on their faces. Farmers left their fields, retirees pulled on boots they hadn't worn in years, teenagers skipped school to join the search. The town of fewer than 3,000 people suddenly swelled with bodies, all united by a single, desperate goal: bring Lilly and Jack home. Staff Sergeant Mike Davidson of the RCMP stood before the growing crowd, his voice carrying the weight of command and the urgency of a ticking clock. "We're going to establish a grid system," he announced, pointing to a large map spread across the hood of a police cruiser. "Every inch of these woods will be searched. Every trail, every creek bed, every fallen log." The volunteers nodded, their faces grim with purpose. They understood what he wasn't saying, that the first 48 hours were critical, that statistics weren't on their side, that every minute that passed made the likelihood of finding the children alive grow smaller. But they also understood something else. These were their children too, in the way that small communities claim every child as their own. The search operation was massive, coordinated with military precision. 9 units arrived from 3 provinces, their handlers speaking in hushed tones about scent trails and weather conditions. Drone operators set up equipment that looked like it belonged on a movie set, their cameras capable of seeing heat signatures through dense forest canopy. "The first thing we do," explained Sarah Mitchell, a veteran search and rescue coordinator, "is establish what we call the IPP, the initial planning point. That's the last place the children were definitely seen. In this case, that was the living room of the Sullivan trailer. From there, they would work outward in expanding circles, like ripples in a pond. The first K-9 team arrived just after sunrise. The handler, a weathered man named Jim Peters who'd been doing this work for 15 years, approached the trailer with his German Shepherd, Rex. The dog was trained to distinguish between different types of scents, the living and the dead. Rex is going to pick up their scent from inside the house, Peters explained to the gathered investigators. Then we'll see where it leads. What happened next would haunt everyone present. Rex immediately picked up the children's scent in the living room, his nose working efficiently across the carpet, the couch, the coffee table where Jack's juice box still sat. The dog moved with purpose toward the kitchen, then to the sliding glass door. And then he stopped. Not gradually, not with the hesitation of a scent growing fainter. He stopped abruptly, as if he'd hit an invisible wall. He circled the threshold of the door, whining softly, his tail dropping low. "What's he doing?" Caroline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peters frowned, encouraging Rex forward, but the dog wouldn't cross onto the back deck. "The scent trail ends here," he said finally, his voice heavy with confusion. "It just ends." 2 more K, 9 teams were brought in. Max, a bloodhound with an impeccable track record. Luna, a search dog who'd found missing children in conditions far more challenging than this. The result was the same every time. The scent trail stopped at the sliding glass door. In 15 years of doing this, Peters would later tell reporters, "I've never seen anything like it. It's like the children walked to that door and then vanished." Meanwhile, the human searchers pressed deeper into the woods. The terrain around the Sullivan property was challenging, dense forest broken by steep ravines, marshy areas, and a network of old logging roads that hadn't been maintained in decades. "Lilly. Jack." The calls echoed through the trees, hundreds of voices creating a chorus of desperation. "Can you hear us?" Volunteers walked arm in arm through the underbrush, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign, a piece of clothing, a footprint, a broken branch that might indicate small bodies had passed this way. Drone operators flew methodical patterns overhead, their thermal cameras searching for heat signatures that might indicate life. But the forest remained stubbornly silent. It was eerie, recalled volunteer Martha Reynolds, a retired teacher who'd joined the search. "Usually when you're in the woods, there's sound, birds, wind in the trees, small animals moving through the brush. But it was like the forest was holding its breath." As the hours turned into days, the initial optimism began to fade. Search parameters were expanded. Divers were brought in to search nearby ponds and creek beds. Ground-penetrating radar was used to check areas where the earth looked recently disturbed. On the 3rd day, something shifted in the investigation. The questions became sharper, more pointed. The focus turned inward. When you stepped outside to feed the chickens, Detective Lisa Hartman asked Caroline, "How long were you gone?" 5 minutes. Maybe 10 at the most. "And the sliding door, you're certain it was closed when you left?" Caroline hesitated, and in that hesitation, doubt crept in. Yes, I think so. I mean, I always keep it closed. The kids know they're not supposed to go outside without us." "But you didn't specifically check it before you went out?" "No, I trusted that it was closed." These weren't the questions of investigators looking for lost children anymore. These were the questions of investigators looking for answers that made sense, for explanations that added up, for truth in a case that seemed to defy logic. Because how do 2 children walk out of a house and leave no trace? How do trained search dogs lose a scent at a threshold? How do hundreds of searchers comb through dense forest and find nothing? Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not a single sign that the children had ever been there. The answer, investigators were beginning to realize, might not be in the woods at all. As night fell on the 3rd day of searching, Staff Sergeant Davidson stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness that had swallowed 2 children without a trace. Behind him, the command post buzzed with activity, volunteers updating search grids, 9 handlers discussing strategy, drone operators reviewing footage. But Davidson's attention was fixed on something else entirely, the Sullivan trailer, its windows glowing warm against the darkness. Because sometimes, he knew, the biggest mysteries weren't hidden in the wilderness. Sometimes they were hiding in plain sight. Make sure you're still with us for this journey, because what we're about to uncover gets even more disturbing. If you're finding this as unsettling as I am, hit that like button. It helps us bring more cases like this to light. The sliding glass door became an obsession. It was a standard patio door, nothing special about it. Aluminum frame, clear glass, the kind you'd find in thousands of homes across Canada. But this particular door held secrets that would unravel everything investigators thought they knew about the Sullivan case. "The door doesn't make sound," Daniel Martel had told the first responding officers. "I didn't hear them leave." Daniel was Caroline's partner, the children's stepfather, and, according to the official timeline, the last adult to see Lilly and Jack alive. He'd been in the bedroom, he claimed, just 1 room away from the living room where the children were playing. "I didn't hear anything," he repeated to investigators. No footsteps, no door opening, nothing. The first I knew something was wrong was when Caroline came running in, screaming that the kids were gone. Detective Lisa Hartman wrote down his statement, but something about it nagged at her. She'd been investigating missing persons cases for 8 years, and in her experience, doors make noise. Children make noise. Especially 4-year-old children. So, she decided to test it. 3 days after the disappearance, Hartman returned to the Sullivan trailer with a sound meter and a theory. She positioned herself in the bedroom where Daniel claimed to have been, then had her partner, Detective Ray Morrison, open and close the sliding door repeatedly. The results were troubling. Each time the door opened, the sound meter registered a clear reading. The metal track creaked slightly. The door made a soft whooshing sound as it moved. When it reached the end of its track, there was a definitive thump as it hit the stopper. From the bedroom, with the door closed, these sounds were faint but audible. With the bedroom door open, as Daniel claimed it had been, they were unmistakable. So, either he's lying about hearing the door, Hartman told her supervisor later, or he's lying about where he was when it happened. But Daniel's statement about the silent door was just the beginning of a series of inconsistencies that would transform the investigation from a search and rescue operation into something much darker. When investigators returned to question him more thoroughly, Daniel's story began to shift in subtle but significant ways. First interview. I was in the bedroom, lying down, resting. Second interview. I was in the bedroom, but I was awake, just relaxing. Third interview. I might have dozed off for a few minutes, but I would have heard if something happened. These weren't major contradictions, but they were changes. And changes in witness statements, especially from family members, always raised red flags. Then there was his behavior. While Caroline threw herself into the search efforts, organizing volunteers and speaking to media, Daniel remained conspicuously absent. He didn't join search parties. He didn't appear at community vigils. He gave no interviews to reporters who gathered outside their home. It struck everyone as odd, said neighbor Pete Morrison, no relation to Detective Morrison. Here's a man whose stepchildren are missing, and he's nowhere to be seen. When my dog went missing last year, I was out looking for 3 days straight. These are kids we're talking about. When pressed about his absence from search efforts, Daniel's response was chilling in its casualness. I don't want to get in the way. The professionals know what they're doing. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Daniel's behavior wasn't what he did, it was what he didn't do. He never made a public plea for the children's return. He never addressed potential kidnappers through the media. He never broke down in interviews, never showed the raw emotion that typically consumed parents of missing children. Detective Hartman had seen this before, the calculated calm of someone who knows more than they're saying. The investigation into Daniel's background revealed a man with a complicated past. He'd had run-ins with child services in a previous relationship, though the details were sealed. He'd been unemployed for 6 months before the children's disappearance, spending most of his time at home while Caroline worked. Most significantly, neighbors began coming forward with stories they hadn't initially shared, stories of late-night arguments coming from the Sullivan trailer, of Daniel's temper, of Caroline's increasing isolation in the months before the disappearance. I heard shouting maybe 2 weeks before the kids went missing, reported neighbor Ellen Walsh. It was late, maybe 11 p.m. I couldn't make out words, but someone was very angry. The next day, I saw Caroline with what looked like a bruise on her arm, but when I asked about it, she said she'd bumped into a door. These revelations painted a picture of a household under stress, of relationships fracturing, of secrets hiding behind closed doors. But the sliding door remained the most damning piece of evidence against Daniel's version of events. Because if he was lying about something as simple as whether he could hear the door open, what else was he lying about? Investigators began to construct alternative timelines. What if Daniel hadn't been asleep in the bedroom? What if he'd been awake, alert, and fully aware of what was happening in the living room? What if the reason he didn't hear the children leave wasn't because the door was silent, but because he already knew they were gone? The question that haunted everyone involved in the case was simple but chilling. If Daniel Martel was lying about the door, what was he trying to hide? As the search entered its second week with no sign of Lilly and Jack, investigators were beginning to suspect that the answers they needed wouldn't be found in the forest. They would be found in the silence between Daniel's words, in the space between truth and lies, in the sound of a door that he claimed never made a sound. But doors, like secrets, have a way of opening when you least expect them to. On May 8th, 6 days after Lilly and Jack Sullivan vanished, something unprecedented happened in the world of missing children cases. The mother disappeared too. Not physically. Caroline Sullivan was still alive, still breathing, still somewhere in Nova Scotia. But the woman who had sobbed through 911 calls, who had organized search parties and pleaded with reporters, who had become the public face of a mother's worst nightmare, simply vanished from public view. It started with small things. Caroline stopped appearing at the daily press briefings. She declined interview requests that she had previously accepted eagerly. The missing persons flyers that she had personally distributed at every grocery store and gas station in a 50-mile radius were now being handled by volunteers. Then came the bigger changes. On May 9th, Caroline's Facebook account went dark. Her profile, which had been filled with photos of Lilly and Jack, updates about the search, and pleas for information, was suddenly deactivated. No warning, no explanation, just gone. It was like she erased herself, said Janet Morrison, a volunteer who had worked closely with Caroline in the early days of the search. One day she's everywhere, coordinating volunteers, talking to media, and the next day nothing. Like she'd never existed. But the most shocking development came to light through digital detective work that investigators initially tried to keep quiet. Caroline had blocked Daniel Martel on every social media platform. Facebook, Instagram, even LinkedIn. Every digital connection between the couple had been severed. For investigators familiar with domestic dynamics, this was a red flag the size of Nova Scotia. When partners in a crisis start cutting off communication, explained Dr. Sarah Chin, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case, it usually means one of two things. Either they blame each other for what happened, or one of them knows something the other doesn't want to be associated with. Detective Hartman managed to track Caroline to her sister's house in Halifax, 3 hours away from the search epicenter. When she arrived for what was supposed to be a routine follow-up interview, she found a woman transformed. Gone was the desperate mother who had begged for her children's return. In her place sat someone guarded, careful, choosing her words like she was walking through a minefield. "How are you holding up, Caroline?" Hartman asked gently. "I'm managing," Caroline replied, her eyes fixed on her hands. "This has been difficult. Can you tell me why you left the area?" "The search is still active, and having you nearby would help with volunteer coordination." Caroline's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I needed space. I needed to think." "Think about what?" For a long moment, Caroline said nothing. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of terrible realization. "I keep going over that morning in my head. Over and over. The timeline, the details, who was where and when." She looked up at Hartman, and her eyes held something that chilled the detective to the bone. "And I keep coming back to the same questions." "What questions?" How does someone not hear 2 children leaving the house? How does someone sleep through a 4-year-old opening a heavy sliding door? How does someone claim they would have heard something when they clearly didn't? The implication hung in the air like smoke. Caroline wasn't just grieving the loss of her children. She was questioning everything she thought she knew about the man she'd been living with, the man who claimed to love her children, the man who was supposed to protect them. "Have you shared these concerns with Daniel?" Hartman asked. Caroline's laugh was bitter, hollow. "I tried. The day before I left. I asked him directly, 'How could you not have heard them leave?' His answer was..." She paused, as if the memory physically pained her. "He got angry. Not sad, not confused, not defensive in the way someone would be if they were being wrongly accused. Angry. Like I was threatening him." The conversation revealed more troubling details. Caroline admitted that she and Daniel had been having problems for months before the children disappeared. He'd been drinking more, working less, becoming increasingly volatile. "There were times I thought about leaving," she confessed. "But Lilly and Jack, they seemed to like him well enough." He wasn't cruel to them, just distant. And I thought maybe if I tried harder, if I gave him more space, things would get better. Now, with her children gone and Daniel's story full of holes, Caroline was facing a possibility too horrific to voice, that the man she'd trusted with her children might know more about their disappearance than he was admitting. But the story took an even stranger turn when investigators learned about the phone call. On May 10th, 2 days after Caroline had blocked Daniel on social media, she received a call on her sister's landline. The caller ID showed the Sullivan home number. Caroline answered, expecting to hear Daniel's voice. Instead, she heard something that made her blood freeze. A child's voice, faint and distant, calling Mommy. The call lasted less than 10 seconds before the line went dead. When Caroline tried calling back, the phone at the Sullivan house rang unanswered. Was it a cruel hoax? A glitch in the phone system? Or something more sinister? Detective Hartman immediately ordered phone records for the Sullivan residence. The results were puzzling. According to the phone company, no outgoing calls had been made from that number on May 10th. Yet Caroline's sister's phone clearly showed an incoming call from that exact number at 3:47 p.m. It's impossible, the phone company technician told investigators. Either their records are wrong, or that call was placed using equipment that somehow spoofed the number. The mysterious phone call marked a turning point in the investigation. What had started as a missing persons case was now showing signs of something far more complex and disturbing. Someone was playing games. Someone knew more than they were saying. And someone was using the grief of a desperate mother as a weapon. As investigators dug deeper into the fractures in the Sullivan family, one thing became clear. The happy home that Caroline had described to early responders was a carefully constructed facade. Behind closed doors, tensions had been building for months. The question was, had those tensions finally exploded on the morning of May 2nd? And if so, where were Lilly and Jack Sullivan now? The answer to that question would come from an unexpected source, and when it did, it would shatter every assumption investigators had made about the case. 21 days after Lilly and Jack Sullivan vanished, a jogger found something that stopped her in her tracks. Sarah Chun, no relation to the forensic psychologist, was running her usual route along the Riverside Trail, about 3 miles from the Sullivan property, when a flash of pink caught her eye. Hanging from a low branch over a small creek, torn and dirty, but unmistakably familiar, was a child's shirt. It was pink with a Minnie Mouse design, exactly like the one Lilly had been wearing in the last photograph taken of her. Sarah didn't touch it. She'd watched enough crime shows to know better. Instead, she called 911, then stood guard over the scene until investigators arrived, her heart pounding with the terrible knowledge that she might have found the first real clue in the Sullivan case. Within an hour, the area was swarming with police officers, forensics technicians, and search dogs. The shirt was carefully photographed, measured, and collected. DNA analysis would later confirm what everyone already suspected. It belonged to Lilly Sullivan. But the shirt raised more questions than it answered. First, the location. The Riverside Trail was miles from the original search grid, in the opposite direction from where bloodhounds had lost the children's scent. How had Lilly's shirt ended up here when every indication suggested the children had never left their immediate neighborhood? Second, the condition. The shirt was torn and dirty, showing signs of exposure to weather. But it wasn't faded by sun or completely degraded by rain. Forensic analysis suggested it had been exposed to the elements for days, not weeks. Either the shirt was out here for less time than we think, explained Dr. Marcus Webb, the forensic pathologist examining the evidence, or it was protected from the elements somehow and then moved to this location recently. Third, and most disturbing, was what wasn't found with the shirt. No other clothing, no signs of disturbance in the surrounding area, no footprints or broken vegetation that would indicate someone had struggled through the underbrush. The shirt appeared to have been placed on the branch deliberately. When clothing is torn from a person by force, whether by an attacker or by catching on thorns and branches, there's typically other evidence, explained Detective Morrison. Threads, fibers, sometimes blood, if the skin is scratched. But this shirt? It's isolated. Clean, in forensic terms. The discovery triggered a massive expansion of the search area. Hundreds of volunteers who had been focusing on the woods around the Sullivan home were redirected to the Riverside Trail. Divers searched the creek. Cadaver dogs swept the banks. They found nothing. But the shirt was just the beginning of a series of discoveries that would turn the Sullivan case from a missing persons investigation into something that felt more like psychological warfare. For days after the shirt was found, 2 letters arrived that would haunt everyone who saw them. The first was delivered to the Sullivan home. Daniel found it in the mailbox, a standard white envelope with no return address, postmarked locally, but impossible to trace. Inside was a child's drawing, done in crayon on folded notebook paper. The drawing showed a simple house surrounded by trees. 2 stick figures stood in front of the house, one bigger, one smaller, holding hands. Both figures had crooked smiles drawn in red crayon. Above them, a yellow sun shone down, and flowers dotted the ground around their feet. It was the kind of drawing any 7-year-old might create. Innocent, hopeful, filled with the simple joy of childhood. But at the bottom of the page, in careful block letters, were 4 words that turned the innocent image into something sinister. "We are okay, Mommy." The second letter arrived at the local RCMP detachment that same day. This drawing was different, darker. It showed the same house, but now there were black scribbles covering the windows. The stick figures were gone. In their place was a large red door, and surrounding it, chaotic red marks that could have been decorations or could have been something far more ominous. At the bottom of this drawing, in the same careful block letters, "Don't come looking." Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The letters were printed in the deliberate style children use when they're trying their best to write neatly. DNA testing found no saliva on the envelope flaps, no fingerprints on the paper. But Caroline, when shown the drawings, went pale. "The style," she whispered, staring at the first drawing. "The way she draws the sun, with those zigzag rays instead of straight lines. The way she always makes the house have a triangle roof even when she's copying pictures of houses with flat roofs. This looks like Lilly drew it." The implications were staggering. If Lilly had drawn these pictures, it meant she was alive, or at least had been alive recently enough to create them. But it also meant she was being held somewhere, forced to communicate through drawings that felt more like ransom notes than children's art. The letters triggered a media frenzy. Local news became national news. The Sullivan case, which had been a regional tragedy, suddenly had the attention of the entire country. Cable news shows devoted entire segments to analyzing the drawings. Online forums exploded with theories about their meaning. Child psychologists offered interpretations on talk shows, dissecting every crayon stroke for hidden meaning. But investigators were asking different questions. Who had access to children's art supplies? Who knew enough about Lilly's drawing style to replicate it? And most importantly, who would be cruel enough to torture a grieving mother with the possibility that her children were alive when they might already be dead? The letters were postmarked from the same postal region as the Sullivan home, suggesting they had been mailed locally. Security cameras at the local post office were reviewed, but they showed nothing useful. Dozens of people mailing letters and packages, any one of whom could have been the sender. "Someone's playing games," Detective Hartman told her supervisor. "The question is whether it's someone who has the children, someone who knows what happened to them, or someone who's just sick enough to exploit this family's tragedy." The timing of the discoveries, first the shirt, then the letters, suggested a pattern. Someone was feeding information to investigators and the media in carefully measured doses. But to what end? If the goal was to keep the case in the public eye, it was working. The Sullivan children were front-page news across Canada. Their faces appeared on billboards and milk cartons. The hashtag #FindLillyandJack trended on social media. But if the goal was to help find the children, the clues were remarkably unhelpful. The shirt had been forensically clean. The letters provided no concrete information about the children's location or condition. It was as if someone wanted the case to remain unsolved while appearing to help solve it. As May turned to June, investigators found themselves chasing ghosts. Every lead seemed to evaporate under scrutiny. Every clue raised more questions than it answered. But they were about to discover that the real mystery wasn't where Lilly and Jack had gone. The real mystery was who was controlling the narrative of their disappearance, and why. Stay with me here, because what happens next will make you question everything we've discussed so far. If this case has grabbed you like it's grabbed me, smash that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. By June 1st, exactly 1 month after the children disappeared, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police made a decision that changed everything. They stopped calling it a missing persons case. "We are now treating this as a potential criminal investigation," Staff Sergeant Davidson announced at a somber press conference. "We have not ruled out the possibility of foul play." The language was careful, diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. After a month of searching forests and following false leads, investigators had concluded that Lilly and Jack Sullivan hadn't simply wandered off. Someone had taken them. Or worse. The shift in approach was immediate and dramatic. The Sullivan trailer, which had been treated as the starting point of a search operation, was now processed as a potential crime scene. Forensics technicians arrived with luminol spray, looking for blood traces that might have been cleaned up. They swabbed surfaces for DNA, lifted fingerprints, and photographed everything from multiple angles. "When you change from a missing persons case to a criminal investigation," explained retired RCMP investigator Tom Bradley, "you start looking at everything differently. That living room isn't just where the kids were last seen, it's potentially where a crime was committed. Those family members aren't just victims, they're potential suspects." Daniel Martel and Caroline Sullivan were both asked to submit to polygraph examinations. The results were never made public, but sources close to the investigation reported that both tests were inconclusive. Police speak for results that neither clearly indicated deception nor confirmed truthfulness. More troubling were the inconsistencies that emerged when investigators began examining the timeline more carefully. Caroline had initially said she was outside feeding chickens for 5 minutes, maybe 10 at the most. But a reconstruction of her routine, timed by investigators, consistently took between 12 and 15 minutes. Security footage from a neighbor's farm showed Caroline's car parked at the Sullivan property at times that didn't match her stated schedule. Daniel's story shifted subtly with each retelling. The bedroom where he claimed to have been resting was examined by acoustics experts, who confirmed that sounds from the living room would have been clearly audible. Yet Daniel maintained he had heard nothing. "Either he's lying about where he was," Detective Hartman wrote in her case notes, "or he's lying about what he heard. Either way, he's lying." But the most damaging evidence against the family came from an unexpected source: their own neighbors. Janet Collins, who lived in the trailer closest to the Sullivans, came forward with information she'd been reluctant to share initially. On the night before the children disappeared, she had heard what sounded like a violent argument coming from the Sullivan home. "It was around 11 p.m., she told investigators. "I was getting ready for bed when I heard shouting. A man's voice, very angry. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was frightening. Then I heard a woman crying." When asked why she hadn't reported this earlier, Collins looked ashamed. "You don't want to be the neighbor who calls the police every time people fight." And Caroline, she was always so private about her personal life. But now, knowing what happened the next day, other neighbors began coming forward with similar stories. The Sullivans had seemed like a quiet family, but behind closed doors, there had been signs of trouble. Mike Patterson, who lived across the road, remembered seeing Caroline with what appeared to be bruises on her arms several weeks before the disappearance. When he'd asked if she was okay, she'd quickly pulled down her sleeves and changed the subject. Ellen Walsh recalled hearing children crying late at night on multiple occasions. Not normal crying like when kids have nightmares. This was different. Scared crying. The picture that emerged was of a household under increasing stress, of adults struggling with problems they kept hidden from the outside world. Child Protective Services was contacted, and their files revealed another troubling detail. They had received an anonymous tip about the Sullivan household just 6 weeks before the children disappeared. The caller had reported concerns about neglect and possible abuse, but when social workers visited the home, they found no evidence of immediate danger. The case file noted that the children appeared somewhat withdrawn but showed no signs of physical abuse. Caroline had been cooperative during the interview, and Daniel had been polite but distant. The case was classified as unfounded and closed. Now investigators wondered if they had missed warning signs, if intervention might have prevented whatever had happened to Lilly and Jack. Phone records from the Sullivan household revealed another troubling pattern. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, Daniel had been making frequent calls to a number registered to a payday loan company. Financial records showed the family was deeply in debt, with credit cards maxed out and bills piling up. Financial stress is a major risk factor in family violence cases, explained Dr. Sarah Chin, the forensic psychologist consulting on the case. When people are desperate about money, when they feel trapped and hopeless, they sometimes make terrible decisions. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from Daniel's internet search history. In the 2 weeks before the children disappeared, someone using the home computer had searched for information about missing children cases, specifically focusing on how police investigations were conducted and how long it typically took for search efforts to be called off. There were searches for how long do police look for missing children and when do missing person cases go cold, and most disturbing of all, how to make someone disappear without a trace. When confronted with this evidence, Daniel claimed he had been researching the topic out of curiosity about other missing children cases he'd seen in the news. But investigators found no evidence that he had ever shown interest in true crime or missing persons cases before his stepchildren disappeared. The web search history painted a picture of premeditation, of someone planning something terrible and researching how to get away with it. As summer arrived in Nova Scotia, the case that had begun with hope and community solidarity had transformed into something much darker. The woods around the Sullivan property had been searched so thoroughly that every tree seemed familiar to the volunteers. But the children remained missing, and the evidence was pointing in a direction that no one wanted to acknowledge. What if Lilly and Jack Sullivan had never left their home alive? What if the answer to their disappearance wasn't hiding in the forest, but in the secrets that had been festering behind the closed doors of their own home? The investigation was about to take another shocking turn, one that would divide the community and force everyone to confront the possibility that evil doesn't always come from strangers in the woods. Sometimes it lives in the house next door. 3 weeks after Lily's shirt was found, something happened that would transform the Sullivan case from a tragic mystery into a criminal investigation focused on deception and misdirection. A child's blanket was discovered in the woods. But this wasn't just any discovery. This was Lily's favorite blanket, a soft pink fleece throw with cartoon unicorns that she'd slept with every night since she was 3 years old. Caroline had mentioned it in early interviews, describing how Lilly couldn't fall asleep without uni, as she called it. The blanket was found by a volunteer searcher named Mark Thompson, about 300 meters from the Sullivan trailer, tangled in the underbrush near a dry creek bed. The location itself wasn't unusual. It was within the expanded search grid that teams had been working since the shirt discovery. What was unusual was the timing. That area had been searched, Thompson told investigators, his voice carrying the confusion that everyone felt. I'd personally walked through there at least 3 times in the first week. My team swept that exact spot. There was nothing there. Thompson wasn't alone in his certainty. Search and rescue coordinator Sarah Mitchell reviewed her logs and confirmed that the area where the blanket was found had been thoroughly examined by multiple teams using ground searches, K-9 units, and drone surveillance. Either we missed it every single time, which would be unprecedented given the thoroughness of our search, or it wasn't there when we looked, Mitchell said grimly. Detective Hartman arrived at the scene within an hour of the discovery. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions about the Sullivan case. The blanket was clean. Not pristine, but far cleaner than it should have been after 3 weeks in the Nova Scotia wilderness. There was forest debris stuck to it, leaves, small twigs, some pollen, but no significant staining, no weather damage, no signs of prolonged exposure to rain and sun. More telling was its condition. The blanket wasn't torn or damaged. It wasn't buried or hidden. It was simply lying on the surface, partially tangled in some low bushes as if it had been gently placed there. If a child had been carrying this blanket while fleeing through dense forest, Hartman noted in her report, we would expect to see tears, snags, possibly blood if they were frightened and running. Instead, this looks like it was carefully positioned. Forensic analysis of the blanket revealed the most damning evidence yet. Despite being Lily's favorite possession, something she slept with every night, the blanket contained no DNA from the child. No hair follicles, no saliva, no skin cells, nothing that would indicate recent contact with Lilly Sullivan. "It's impossible," explained Dr. Marcus Webb, the forensic pathologist. "A child who sleeps with a blanket every night leaves traces. We should have found something, dead skin cells at minimum. The fact that it's forensically clean suggests it was washed before being placed in that location." But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the blanket discovery was what it revealed about the perpetrator's psychology. Someone was playing an elaborate game with investigators, feeding them clues designed to maintain interest in the case while providing no actual information about the children's whereabouts. The pattern was becoming clear. First, the shirt, found in a location far from the original search area, forensically clean and appearing to have been placed rather than lost. Then, the mysterious drawings with their cryptic messages. Now the blanket, discovered in a previously searched area weeks after the fact, also forensically clean. Someone was controlling the narrative of the Sullivan case, drip-feeding evidence to keep investigators engaged while leading them further away from the truth. Detective Hartman convened a task force meeting to discuss what they were now calling the planted evidence scenario. "We're dealing with someone who understands how missing persons investigations work," she told the assembled investigators. "They know that physical evidence keeps cases active, keeps media attention focused, keeps resources allocated to the search." But who had this level of knowledge about police procedures? Who had access to the children's belongings? And most importantly, who would be cruel enough to torture a community with false hope? The answer seemed obvious, but it was so disturbing that investigators hesitated to voice it publicly. The most likely suspect was someone close to the children, someone who lived in their home, someone who had intimate knowledge of their belongings and routines. Someone who might have taken these items before the children disappeared, holding them back to use as props in an elaborate deception. When investigators returned to interview Daniel Martel about the blanket discovery, his reaction was telling. He showed no surprise, no relief that another clue had been found, no hope that it might lead to the children. Instead, he seemed almost resigned, as if he had been expecting this development. "These things keep turning up," he said flatly when shown photos of the blanket's discovery site. "I don't know what to make of it." When asked if he recognized the blanket, Daniel nodded. "Yeah, that's Lily's. She called it uni or something like that. Always had to have it at bedtime." "When did you last see this blanket?" Detective Morrison asked. Daniel paused, and in that pause, investigators sensed calculation. "I don't know. Maybe the night before they went missing? Lily usually left it on her bed in the morning." But Caroline, when contacted at her sister's house, told a different story. "Lily had that blanket with her on the couch that morning," she said with certainty. "She was wrapped up in it while watching cartoons. When I found her and Jack gone, the blanket was gone too. I specifically looked for it because I thought if they'd taken it with them, it might mean they'd planned to come back." The contradiction was significant. If Caroline was telling the truth, then the blanket should have been with Lily when she disappeared. If Daniel was telling the truth, it should have been left behind in the bedroom. One of them was lying. The discovery of the planted evidence marked a turning point in the investigation. Investigators were no longer just looking for missing children. They were trying to solve a puzzle created by someone who wanted to confuse and mislead them. But puzzles have solutions, and the person behind this elaborate deception was starting to make mistakes. Each planted piece of evidence revealed more about their psychology, their knowledge, their access to the children's belongings. Most importantly, it revealed their desperation to control a narrative that was beginning to slip away from them. As investigators worked to unravel the deception, one question haunted everyone involved in the case. If someone was going to such elaborate lengths to mislead the investigation, what were they trying to hide? The answer to that question would shake the community to its core and reveal a truth so dark that some people would refuse to believe it. But first, the case would take one more shocking turn, one that would expose the power and danger of the internet age, where anyone can become a detective and everyone has a theory about what really happened to two missing children. In the age of social media, missing children cases don't just capture local attention. They become global obsessions. The Sullivan case was about to learn this lesson in the most destructive way possible. It started innocently enough. A Facebook group called Find Lilly and Jack Sullivan was created by well-meaning locals who wanted to coordinate search efforts and share information. Within days, it had hundreds of members. Within weeks, thousands. But somewhere along the way, the group transformed from a tool for community organization into something far more sinister, a digital lynch mob armed with theories, accusations, and the dangerous certainty that they could solve a case that had stumped professional investigators. The moderators lost control quickly. What had been respectful posts about search schedules and volunteer coordination became wild speculation about family members, neighbors, and anyone who had ever come into contact with the Sullivan children. Reddit joined the fray, with multiple subreddits dedicated to the case. r/Sullivan Mystery attracted amateur detectives who pored over every photo, every interview, every piece of public information, looking for clues that police had supposedly missed. One user, going by the handle TruthSeeker 2025, posted a detailed timeline that identified what they called inconsistencies in Caroline's story. Another user, Forensic Fan, created elaborate maps showing possible routes the children might have taken, complete with satellite imagery and elevation charts. The problem wasn't the enthusiasm, it was the conclusions they were drawing. Based on my analysis of body language in the 911 call, posted user Detective Mom, Caroline Sullivan is clearly lying. Listen to the pauses, the way her voice changes when she describes finding them gone. This is not how a genuinely surprised mother would sound. These weren't trained investigators. They weren't forensic psychologists or body language experts. They were people with internet access and strong opinions, but their amateur analysis was being shared and reshared as if it were professional evidence. TikTok made everything worse. Short videos analyzing everything from Caroline's facial expressions to the layout of the Sullivan property went viral. Teenage amateur detectives with no understanding of trauma or grief made definitive statements about guilt and innocence based on carefully edited clips. One TikTok user gained 100,000 followers by posting daily Sullivan case updates that were really just speculation presented as fact. Another created a series called Red Flags the Police Missed that pointed to completely normal behavior as evidence of guilt. The online investigators didn't limit themselves to analyzing public information. They began digging into the family's private lives with a thoroughness that would have made professional stalkers proud.